welcome everybody. We're going to get started. So today we're going to talk about, we got a couple pros. They have extensive expertise. I can't wait to introduce them to you, Nadine and Richard. The ESG, we're focused on the S in social impact and ESG. And if you're looking for a little bit of background info, we put this on here as well. According to this research, 129 S&P 500 companies cited ESG during the Q4 21 earnings calls. It's just becoming more and more reported on, more and more important. Global investor demand for ESG stood strong and provided resilience amid the COVID-19 market. There seems to be a correlation between companies that are mature enough to take a sophisticated approach on ESG as an indicator probably of their overall health as a company. So I don't know if ESG made them more resilient or if it was just really resilient companies do this kind of behavior. 9 out of 10 workers would take a pay cut for a job they feel has meaning. And of course, this last one, nearly 8 out of 10 Americans say they are more loyal to purpose-driven brands, and purpose is all over the place. I was just talking to the head of CSR for Deloitte, and they now have a purpose czar, a purpose person. It's its own purpose vertical. So ESG is instrumental in demonstrating purpose and legitimacy. We have two people who know what they're talking about in this space. We have first Nadine Ritcheson. She's the founder and CEO of P3 for Humanity. And she's going to explain a little bit more about that. I put all of this interesting info in here so you can check it out on the deck later. You can read it right now. But most recently, Nadine was a team lead advisor for USAID Africa Ebola Unit. Excited to have her here. Also, we're thrilled to have Dr. Richard Columbia. 30 years of experience working across 65 countries in design, funding, implementation, management, and utilization, research, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Extensive travel, a very multinational perspective. And we're really lucky with our small group of people to have such prominent experts with us today. I'm very excited to have you here. Thanks for joining us, Nadine. Richard.
We really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining today. We think that today's conversation is really going to help you understand kind of contextually where we find ourselves. Because I think a lot of CSR representatives are thinking, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for. They're trying as fast as they can to absorb the incredible amount of information that's coming at them, either by, from the international sustainable development world or from the ESG world that you spoke about. And I think that sometimes we just need to slow down a little bit, explain how the evolution of this happened, and now introduce a tool, a framework, whatever you want to call it, that we use in the international realm that is extremely beneficial for measuring and for due diligence, really. And that's what ESG is going to be all about. Richard's expertise is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And when we talk about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, what I'm talking about is measurement, data, and extrapolating that the granular level of information from that data and putting it back into your programs to improve the way you do social impact programming. We launched P3 for Humanity in March, so it's relatively new, but it's been 17 years in the making. I originally wrote the white paper 17 years ago because when I was responding to disasters, I was being approached by corporations to go look at their programs because they didn't have access. They didn't have people who would go to dangerous zones to go and see the status of their programs. And there was very little validation or verification being done. So I kind of stuck that in the back of my head. I've thought about it over and over again. So we created P3 for Humanity basically to work with any type of organization, whether it's corporate, nonprofit, whomever, government, you name it, to help companies or organizations that are working in sustainable development, social impact programming, improve the way they make positive impact in their program by strengthening the way they do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. It is particularly important right now when almost every single social impact program or sustainable development program has been impacted by COVID, right? I can't think of very many, particularly in the international realm. So many have gotten off track and nobody's been able to go take a look at those programs. Nobody can determine what the status of their programming is right now. And we, given our skill sets, we're perfectly situated to go out to programs, do in-depth assessments of where your programs stand now, tell you what the environment is. We have an amazing partner in Country Watch that writes specific reports to your corporate needs, where your programs are, what they're working on, that includes socioeconomic, political details that affect your programs. And if you don't know that, you're going to be caught off guard. So we want to help you make your programs better so that your impact is greater. We're going to explain to you this international development framework that is a really powerful tool that anybody who works in international development knows works. So for anybody who's working in social impact programming or aspires to work in it, this is a critical framework that you must be familiar with because your implementing partners should be using it. And we're going to help you identify where things need to be strengthened. So we also think this framework, this tool, is a game changer when we talk about meeting the SDGs for 2030. So I don't need to tell you that the playing field is changing quickly. As you mentioned, Chris, ESG is playing a more prominent driving function in how CSR and everybody, corporate everybody, is working. And where corporations are being asked to rapidly pivot and move from measuring performance to measuring effectiveness, right? And so everybody is scrambling to meet those needs. Right now, the focus has been primarily on DE&I. Please don't forget about your programs overseas, because those will be the targets next. And you need to be prepared. And if you're not, you'll be caught off guard and your company will be at risk. Over the past 15 to 20 years, we have seen an just exponential increase in humanitarian needs as a result of climate change, civil unrest. People are in need. It has begun, and actually it already has surpassed the capability of most traditional humanitarian actors to respond, being governments, large nonprofits, and international organizations. As a result, over the last 20 years, there's been increasing corporate engagement through your CSR activities, which is desperately needed. However, we find ourselves now with two fields overlapping. And what we're observing is that we're working in silos. We're not speaking the same languages. We're at a critical moment in time where we don't have the luxury of doing that anymore. You know, we need to combine all of our assets, our knowledge, share them with each other. And customers and investors are now demanding it, as you know, through ESG. They're demanding it through their voting on investments, and millennials and Gen Zs are using their purchasing power to influence the success or failure of so many products and so many brands. In addition to that, employees want to be engaged with companies and work for companies that do good. They don't want to be the ones working for companies that don't have a strategy to do good and feel good about what they do every day. So it's critically important that companies address this. P3 for Humanity focuses on the S, which is the social. We need to understand E, S, and G are very different animals. And people who say that they can do all three, I don't know, but we focus on S, and that is the human component. And so that's what our focus is. Over the last 6 months or so, I've spoken to a lot of people, and I've heard an incredible amount about sustainable supply chains. But I think in focusing on sustainable supply chains, you're missing the big picture. Because what these investors and consumers and Gen X and Gen Z are asking about is the human component, right? It's everything that precedes that supply chain. if you're not looking for the secondary and tertiary effects of your programs, you could be sideswiped. And we believe that we can align your corporate strategy in a way that produces real outcomes instead of just getting incomes, inputs and outputs, right? That's beneficial to everyone, but it has to be done properly. When Richard and I were working on Ebola, and that's how we actually met, we were working on the recovery efforts. And one small part of what we were doing was an evaluation of the 140 programs that USAID had put in place. And so we needed to determine whether we were meeting targets and objectives. So we did kind of a parallel and retrospective study on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. In Guinea, we had some cross-cutting programs that brought women together for what we call cash transfers, food security, and health, I think it was. And as a result of all of these women coming together to do those other programs that we funded, they started to organize themselves. They started to create female woman empowerment project and gave each other microloans. We did not fund that. That was a secondary effect that came out of programs that we were doing. If your company is not looking for those secondary and tertiary effects, then you lose out on some good nuggets and good stories of how successful your programs are. And conversely, if you're not looking at secondary and tertiary effects, you are putting your company at risk because it's negative, then somebody will find out. So you need people who understand the environment in which these programs are being done.
Nadine, we think about when we do something in the community, what are the primary effects, right? So how many people got fed, whatnot. And we're willing to report how many lives touched, whatever that may mean.
What does that mean?
And even if it does mean something, it could mean something bad, right? As you just pointed out. So when you think about your circles, you got your primary effects, you've got your secondary effects, and then tertiary. And you're saying that we should look not just at what we do directly as a result of the program, but then the ecosystem around it. And for many people, like, that makes sense. That sounds perfectly okay. I can barely report on primary effects. Right. And would you be open to having, maybe, Jerome, I would love to hear what you think about when you think of the results of Marriott's, say, corporate investments or something simple, but how hard is it to look at that secondary and tertiary outcome, whether positive or negative?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things. I think to Nadine's point, some people don't know to look for some of the secondary and tertiary effects. Some people also, I think, mistakenly believe that they're already doing good work because they're looking at the outputs. They don't think about the outcomes. Right. But say me, for example, I know to look for those immediate and long-term outcomes, but to get to that level of detail with the capacity that our team has, with the tools that we have that allow to a varying degree of capability to dig into those details, it's incredibly difficult to get to that depth of outcome evaluations and measurement for the thousands of organizations that we're serving, right? Because some of that information we can get from many of our national or international partners who really do, in fact, have a more sophisticated measurement collection platforms where they're actually understanding their own organizational outcomes. So they can share that with us, of course. But when you look at all across the board, I'm going to use America as an example. We have 1.5 million tax-exempt organizations. A majority of them are not with that same level of sophistication. So if I go right down the street to, say, an organization that might have 3 staff, mostly an all-volunteer force, who are doing good work, their ability to share some of those program outcomes might also be limited in what they can even share with us from an organizational perspective. So I know to look for those outcomes, but to get to that, to mine the data that deep, is incredibly difficult.
It's true. And you may not actually find secondary or tertiary effects, which is fine. You know, your measurements are only as good as your program design. And program design is at the very beginning. This framework that we want to talk about today, it's not perfect, but from what we've seen out there, and one thing that has really surprised me is that nowhere in that process do they include civil society or the communities that they serve, right? And that's just setting yourself up for disaster. If we've learned anything in international development, is that the key stakeholders have to be part of that. And that's actually where you get a lot of your information. And that helps you determine what your indicators are, and also avoiding setting your foundation on a faulty premise. Because if you set your foundation on a faulty premise, you will definitely get faulty results, and you won't meet your goals and you won't meet your objectives. And worse yet, you won't even know what your baseline is. And right now, what we're being asked to do is measure your progress. How do you measure progress when you don't even know where you started? So all of these things have to be done in the context of a good program design. And then monitoring and evaluation comes on top to ensure and validate that process. So let me just really quickly, people have asked, well, who pays for this stuff? If you have a program, you own it. You should be paying for monitoring and evaluation in addition to what your implementing partner is doing, because it's in your interest, long run, to get correct data, to be able to decipher and distill that data. And it's not a quick turnaround. I know a lot of people in the corporate world want quick information, quick turnaround. These are not, but you know, I've read research paper after research paper that demonstrates that if a company has a good ESG strategy in place or a social impact strategy in place, they actually do better in the long run. And if they don't and they fail, investors and consumers are actually far more forgiving because they've actually done the due diligence to put something in place to address that.
A couple of points. One, we have to involve the stakeholders, but if we're thinking of secondary and tertiary, and we're thinking about a company that is massive, that is a lot of stakeholders and a lot of communities. Secondly, companies should pay for it, but companies barely have enough money to give to the nonprofit to do the work in the first place. So they're not going to pay for all the monitoring. And then they're not going to care about secondary and tertiary because they can't afford to, but they need to be seen to do something. So that's definitely a problem. The third part is most of the nonprofits, it's kind of on them to speak to it, but they weren't invited at the beginning. And now they have to contort themselves to come up with indicators that match what the company thought they wanted, but they didn't involve them in the first place. But how were they going to involve them in the first place? I don't have enough time, I don't have enough money, and I don't know who all the voices are. So when we think about this and the S in all of this, I think there's the entire audience would say, totally understand, really matters. S is about people. Let's go get that data. I can't find the right people. I don't know what conversations to have. I have no budget to do it. It's too big. And I don't have enough time because I got to produce results this quarter. So this is the ideal, but it's not practical. So that's kind of the dissonance that's here between what should happen and what is happening and what can happen. So hopefully the model can bring us a little closer together and marry these two things together.
Let's move over to Richard, and who will tell us about the framework, but I agree with all of that. And that's why we should be talking.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Nadine, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Nadine has touched upon many of the sort of the key points in discussing both the program cycle diagram and as well as the results framework. But to continue, good program design and implementation includes monitoring and evaluation system or plan that collects and places a priority on the use of that data by stakeholders to ensure accountability to results, efficient use of financial and human resources, and to make adjustments to fix short-term shortcomings in the project during its implementation, and to demonstrate social impact. It's also important for mitigating risk due to corruption, violating human rights, or ESG and corporate principles. The program cycle on this slide was developed by USAID in collaboration with many other donor agencies around the world, and is considered a best practice among United Nations, World Bank, numerous donors around the world, most nonprofit organizations working on CSR or ESG and social impact development. The diagram depicts a typical social impact program cycle from its inception to its design, through its implementation, and then the redesign for the next program cycle. Throughout the program cycle, the diagram specifies the timing and application of data needed to improve the design, implementation, and redesign of the program. I think that's really a key point here is that where does MEL, or the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, fit into the program cycle often escapes people or is a mystery, and this really articulates where each of them come in. So for example, the beginning at the top of the diagram is the needs assessment, which then informs the program design through a needs assessment. As you move clockwise towards the bottom, the diagram shows that data from monitoring the implementation of the program is used to ensure the program is progressing as planned and to make evidence-based adjustments, as well as to mitigate risk. Continuing clockwise, the evaluation of the program is conducted either in the penultimate or the final year of the program to measure the social impact the program had and to capture lessons learned and professional recommendations for key stakeholders to consider for the next program cycle. It's also in order to sort of improve the relevance of the program, effectiveness of it, the efficiency, impact, and sustainability. Also, that information from the evaluation can be used to tell the story of the social impact to your stakeholders. This slide is an illustrative example of what we refer to as a results framework. It's another best practice used by donor agencies, nonprofit organizations, universities in the US and around the world. The results framework is a graphic representation of the program logic, which begins with stating the program goal. Many organizations or companies would adopt the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal or Country National Action Plan or sub-goal. At the very least, the program goal should align with or contribute to the Sustainable Development Goal or National Action Plan goal. The next row down is the program outcome. There's often more than one program outcome in a project. The important thing here is that each program outcome clearly contributes to the achievement of the program goal. The next row down, or third row down, is a diagram of program outputs. There are often more than one program output linked to each outcome. The sum of the output results should be sufficient to achieve the expected outcome. If your outcome target was to vaccinate 80% of the children whose parents work at one of your factories, you would need outputs that include the requisite number of vaccines, adequate number of healthcare providers to provide the vaccines in a given time frame, the location to give the vaccines, and sufficient demand for the vaccine from parents with eligible children. Also, part of that should be the sustainability plan, which ensures that vaccinations continue after the program ends. The final two rows are program inputs and activities, which contribute to each program output. Program inputs include funds, human resources, technology, materials, such as the number of vaccines you would contribute or the number of healthcare workers that you have providing the vaccines. Some points about the results framework is that it's usually put together by an interdisciplinary team, which includes the program staff, subject matter experts, a representative from the corporation, and certainly a monitoring, evaluation, and learning expert. The benefits of the results framework is it provides program stakeholders a common framework to describe the program logic. Oftentimes, you'll find that someone who's not a program expert will have, there'll be some challenges in terms of understanding the inputs and how that affects the outputs and the outcomes and ultimately the goal of the project. This lays it out in really clear terms that allows sort of equal footing on the discussion of how the program will operate and the logic of the program. The next stage of once you've articulated your goal and outcome and output statements, is a selection of indicators. And this is used to measure the achievement of program outputs, outcomes, and goals. Once the indicators are agreed upon, targets can be set. The targets are used to assess if adequate input resources, including finance, material, technological, human resources, are available to bring around the expected change. It should also be noted that your program doesn't have to provide all of the inputs or all of the outputs. You oftentimes, if you're linking to national plan of action, then other resources will be contributed by other donors, by the government. It's essential that the targets are set with clear understanding of the input in the resources available. Another common issue, oftentimes you'll set a target, but you won't have the resources to reach that target. But again, with an interdisciplinary team, clearly understanding what the inputs of the program would be able to set realistic targets. Also, it's a living document, so after 1 year, after the second year of adjustments need to be made, then you just go back to the donor and you discuss the new outputs. Just a couple of thoughts. I think that while the monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan is normally or typically created during the program design stage, it can be retrofitted. Nadine gave the example of the Ebola Pillar 2 project. Good example of needing to get the money and the projects running at the quickest pace possible. So it didn't follow, you say it's normal practice of a really well-designed MEL system. And so as a result, we did a lot of the evaluation retroactively and pieced together what occurred. And so that can be done with ongoing projects that you're running as well. Finally, the sort of the quality of results, the information used for program design and monitoring and to showcase impact is really predicated upon having a very strong MEL plan, selecting the correct indicators and methodology for collecting data, analyzing results, and reporting to stakeholders. And of course, working with a reliable intermediary organization such as RW Institute or an ESG firm that specializes in MEL is important.
Richard, two things.
Just so you know, sorry.
Just two things while you're right on it. If you could explain what, I think it's RMEL. You've said MEL a couple times.
Monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. We all have our lingo, so it's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Monitoring, evaluation, and learning.
Yeah, so it's monitoring, which you do during the implementation of the project, the evaluation, which will be done at the end of the project, and both of those, the monitoring is used to make adjustments during the project implementation. So you know something is falling behind a target or what you had expected, or the results aren't coming around as expected, and you would have to rethink, are you missing a component of the project that you didn't anticipate initially? Evaluation that would be used to evaluate the impact of your project, to report to stakeholders, but then also that data would be used in the design or the updating of the next program cycle.
Perfect. So you get thrown into it
using that information effectively
to make better choices, improve.
Yeah,
okay, so moving into an Ebola situation like this, where you don't have time to, you don't have 6 months to build this all out, get it validated, find your stakeholder. We got to solve this now. You constructed something like this, right? A results framework during the work or after?
Yeah. Oh, Nadine, you can talk about the during.
And I want to be conscious of the time. We only have 2 or 3 minutes for this part, but and I want to make sure you get what you're out. But that feels like what a lot of companies and nonprofits feel like. Like, here's the funding, start the work. Well, we should take some time to reach out. No, we need results for this quarter. Let's get going, kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, in the humanitarian response world, we're building the plane while we're flying in many cases. And so in the case of Ebola, it was an interagency group that built the structure of what things would look like. And then you modify, you shift, you pivot. But that's the beauty of this circular framework. There has multiple entry points where no matter where you are with your program, you have opportunities to pivot, and you can course correct if need be. But I want to get back to some of the questions that you asked. Everybody's stretched. The nonprofits are stretched, so they're not going to be providing you the information that you will need. And so I know financially companies are stressed. This hasn't been a priority, but I think things are shifting. I really do believe that if you don't do the due diligence up front, and this is really a pivotal role that CSR representatives have, because they have to get their CEOs and their boards and everyone educated on what it will take to get the information they need to meet the targets, and particularly if now they're being legislated to do so. So it is the return on the investment of doing it right the first time is huge, because otherwise you are wasting resources that you're already stretched for, and you're wasting people's time. And worse yet, you could actually do damage to the people you were intending to help, and that will damage your brand. So while I totally sympathize. I mean, Richard and I work on shoestrings in a lot of cases because we've been implementers and we've been donors. But you can't skimp on things that are critical. And now measurement is becoming critical, because you're going to have to prove that you are working towards meeting certain goals that are being required. It's myopic not to be thinking about these and the cost involved. Because if you're willing to put a ton of money into programs on that stuff, do yourself a favor, do it right, and get the monitoring evaluation so you have the right indicators and you meet your targets. It's pretty simple.
Perfect. And if you want some people who can help you simplify the process and do this kind of work, P3 for Humanity is a group for you. You can see the bullet list of things that they can do. Nadine and Richard are crazy, experienced, insightful, good ideas. Anything you want to say, anything you want to ask, anything at all you want to point us to, Nadine and then Richard.
So I would say you don't have to be an expert in these things. There are people who can help you out there, but at least you know there's a framework that you can use as a frame of reference. You also should know that profitability and growth is not at odds with social impact, but you are responsible for the due diligence that will bring the indicators and the measurements that you need to prove that your programs are successful.
Okay, perfect. Richard.
Just to thank everybody, and thank you, Chris, and thanks to Dana for hosting us. It was an absolute pleasure talking with everybody today.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nadine, thank you. Great to have you.
Thank you.